Okay. So 3 minutes past. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this third session of the 1% Safer Foundation Live and Direct Congress and Conference this week. My name is Emma Evans, and I am a trustee of the 1% Safer Foundation. We are a fully charitable and not-for-profit organisation that have been set up for the last few years, about 6 or 7 volunteers, of which there are some fellow trustees of mine that are on this morning. And basically the commitment and the message and our values for 1% Safer is that this foundation was set up really by the chair of our organisation, Andrew Sharman, and when he created a book back in the COVID pandemic, which brought together a lot of thought leadership and leaders and people that could talk to how to improve safety performance worldwide and look to share that knowledge really for the greater good of trying to make sort of marginal gain improvements, 1% safer globally, worldwide safety performance to basically create, a better safety performance and reduction of incidents worldwide. And that was the message. And this book was created and brought together. And we, through our foundation, promote the sales of that book to raise funds, which we then are allowed to award grants and funding to people that make applications due to the foundation that really support 3 main key commitments, and that's the prevention of poverty, the advancement of education, and also the advancement of citizenship and community development. And those are the causes of what our foundation and our movements are about. And this week really is a champion and raise awareness of that movement. And it's also to mark, obviously, World Global Safety Day on Friday of this week. So we have brought together a whole host of speakers this week to basically do exactly that, share knowledge, share know-how from really well-placed thought leaders in the safety world around us, and bring that knowledge to you and our supporters and the community. So I'm delighted to host this third session today, and I am as a specialist regulatory health and safety lawyer myself, I'm absolutely delighted that we have 2 of my fellow legal minds with us today. We've got Paul Verrico, who is the head of Evershed Sutherland Global EHS practice and health and safety practitioner, a chartered member of IOSH, fellow of the International Institute of Risk Safety Management, fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and many other accolades that sit behind him. And we're also joined by a colleague of his, Sarah Valentine, who's also a partner of Evershed Sutherland, who also acts as a health and safety regulatory practitioner, sits as a coroner, as well as a solicitor advocate. So I'm going to let them tell you all about what they're delighted to tell us all about today, what they're here to cover shortly. We are recording this session, so just put your notice that we are recording. Hopefully we'll be here for about an hour, and we're hoping that at the end of the session we will also have some time for some Q&A from the floor. So without further ado, and with those introductions, may I hand over please to Paul and Sarah.
Thanks, Emma.
Good morning. 25 years ago, when I began my career as a teacher in a sixth form college, there was one lecturer who stood out from everybody else. And when I observed his practice and asked him why the students enjoyed what he was doing so much, he said, the secret, Paul, is you've got to give them a good story. And he very much believed that if you give people a story, they learn. And that's backed up by organisational psychologists who say that learning from a well-told story is remembered more accurately for far longer, and that the lessons hit home in a better way. Let me give you an example. As a child, I was always brought up on the boy who cried wolf. The idea that if you make too much of something, and then when it really is time to make a noise, that people will ignore you. My mum would point a finger at me and say, Paul, boy who cried wolf. And I understood the point. And today, Sarah and I are going to tell a story. And it's an epic story because it starts 70 years ago with the ascent of Mount Everest. We go through 1996 and another ascent of the mountain. And we bring it through to some case studies and thought processes that are very relevant here today in 2023, as we all work to be 1% or more safer. So let's go on to our story. As Emma introduced us, Sarah and I sadly get involved in many cases when things go wrong. and our daily diet is of industrial injury, industrial incident, sometimes fatalities at work. And when we go to site and we do an accident investigation, one of the things that we often find is that it's really difficult to find one specific cause of an incident. Normally, there's a perfect storm where root cause is very much a thing of maybe 10 years ago. And what we normally find is a number of causes all coming together in James Reason's classic Swiss cheese, where you go, okay, there are all these different factors. And if one of them was missing, the thing wouldn't have happened. And of course, that's where we get the whole idea of SIF from, and the DECRA model of the fact that we can have a PSIF, a potential SIF, where there's just one factor missing that would cause a fatality. And as we look at the rope theory, which Sarah and I wrote and was published across IOSH earlier this year, we look at 4 elements that together we see in many of the cases that we get involved in. So let's take you across to the Tibet side of Mount Everest. And it's really only 70 years ago this year that Sir Edmund Hillary first summited that mountain. And I'm going to read to you what he said about the climb. And I'm not going to take on his tones, but I'll do my best. After an hour's steady going, we reached the foot of the most formidable looking problem on the ridge, a rock step some 40 feet high. We'd known of the existence of this step from aerial photographs, and we'd also seen it through our binoculars. We realised that at this altitude, it might well spell the difference between success and failure. The rock itself, smooth and almost holdless, might have been an interesting Sunday afternoon problem for a group of climbers in the Lake District, but here it was a barrier beyond our feeble strength to overcome. I could see no way of turning it on the steep rock bluff on the west. But fortunately, another possibility of tackling it still remained. On its east side was another great cornice, and running up the fully 40 feet of the step was a narrow crack. Leaving Tenzing to belay me as best he could, I jammed my way into this crack, and kicking backwards with my crampons, I sank their spikes deep into the snow behind me and levered myself off the ground. Taking advantage of every little rock hold and all the force of knee, shoulder and arms I could muster, I cramponed backwards up the crack with a fervent prayer that it would hold. For a few moments, at the top of the rock, I dragged myself onto a wide ledge. I regained my breath and realised that nothing was going to stop me from reaching the top. I signalled Tenzing to come on up. I heaved hard on the rope and he collapsed exhausted behind me. That ridge became known afterwards as the Hillary Step. And what's fascinating about it is that Sir Edmund Hillary himself made the quite astute comment that on its own, that wasn't a difficult problem. But at the very summit of Everest, when they'd spent a long time getting there, and when there was just one thing left to do, it became almost insurmountable. An unaided Hillary Step climb on its own was a class 4 rock climb. And according to the Yosemite system, which is used for rock climbing, that is nowhere near as hard as many of the other ways to ascend. In fact, claims go all the way up to class 5.15. So natural protection could be found. It shouldn't have been difficult. But it wasn't. It was almost impossible. And why is that? And the reason is, and the predication for our theory, is that there were certain hazards on that final hurdle that look at rope. And rope stands for rest, observation, planning, and empowerment. And as you'll see on the slide, because of the height of Everest, those climbing will typically have spent weeks at base and intermediate camp. So you go up, you go down, you go up, you go down, so you'll acclimatise to the pressure and the height, and you get really tired. You've exhausted when you get to that final hurdle. And actually, those of you who follow Instagram and look at any of the climbing accounts will see that the people who are getting ready for the May summit this year are currently in the process of going up and down to do that acclimatization at the moment. So we're going to take you through the R of rope first, rest. What one of the people who summited in 1996 found, a man called John Krakauer, and his account got made into the motion picture Everest, was interestingly that people who were summiting Everest had a very different perception of their own ability to that of those around them. In fact, he said, people's perceptions of their own abilities are amazingly far off the mark. One teammate, for instance, was reduced to a helpless, infantile state by his infirmities. He needed extensive help to make it down the Southern Col on one of these acclimatization expeditions. He didn't remember it like that. His view is that he was just fine, a bit tired, and doesn't need any help. And that's a really critical point when we look at rest.
Thanks, Paul. So lack of sleep, it's probably something all of us have experienced, particularly over the last few years with the pandemic, all working much longer hours, battling things at home as well as at work. On a personal level, I've got a 4-month-old at home, so I do definitely understand lack of sleep now, and how that's going to impact my ability to work and my decision making. So I think what's clear about fatigue, lack of rest, is that it affects everybody in every line of work. Both personally, but also, whilst they're at work, working with employees and their colleagues. So Paul's already touched on how rest falls into rope and why it's at the forefront of our rope theory. I'm just going to briefly look at some issues when we are sleep deprived and what this gives rise to. Unfortunately, as Paul touched on, we do investigate and assist organisations when incidents have occurred, and in some instances this is related to fatigue. And it's important that organisations take this into account when they're risk assessing, putting teams together and setting their safety framework. So what happens when we are sleep deprived? We probably can all see times when this has perhaps happened to us: lack of judgment, failure to perceive risk, perhaps cutting corners. We've seen employees cut corners and try and take a quicker route to reaching a resolution. Some of the case studies we've seen have been as a result of fatigue and a lack of sleep. An example of an example or an instance, shall I say, when one of this happened was when a gentleman was going to a construction site. And often with construction sites, we've seen over the years that workers travel some distance in order to pick up those jobs for a project for a number of months. And this gentleman was travelling from the top of Scotland over to a site in the north of England. And he was setting off at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning to be able to get there to start the shift on the Monday morning. And if they finished quickly by Friday lunchtime, they could get on their way again. So when he came into work on a Monday, been doing this for a number of months, unfortunately at 11 a.m. an incident occurred where he was crushed between some machinery that he shouldn't have been standing near. And the reason, when we conducted the investigation, spoke to colleagues, witnesses and the management team, and looked at the documentation, the framework and planning around that job, we identified that this individual was probably fatigued. He knew what to be doing. He'd seen the framework, he'd seen the risk assessment, he'd attended the morning daily brief, and he was a very experienced and competent individual, but in the wrong place at the wrong time because he was making poor decisions and was tired. And it's really for organisations to make sure they're aware of shift patterns, the impact it may have on their workforce, and to think about where people came from, where they were travelling from to do this type of work. And that was one of the contributing factors that came out of the incident investigation, that nobody knew this individual was travelling from the other side of Scotland to turn up for that shift on a Monday morning, because he wasn't going to stay the night before, because it was going to come out of his pocket if he stayed locally. So looking forward, that organisation put in places and safeguards to protect those workers who potentially could be fatigued, and looked at putting them up that night before, so they started that week after having a good rest and a good sleep pattern.
In 2007, a civil case in the UK dealt with a situation in which a young man was paralysed when he'd arrived at work at 3:30 a.m. after 4 hours sleep, to fit a kitchen approximately 110 miles away from his home. His boss had a philosophy of eating's cheating and you'll sleep when you're dead. And unfortunately, that's almost what happened. Once they got to their job 110 miles away, they were given another job 120 miles further away, and the employee went to sleep at the wheel. And unfortunately, that resulted in this paralysing incident. In giving judgment, the judge said, companies need to be sure that their employees are in a fit condition to drive and have adequate quality sleep before getting behind the wheel. In this instance, the man, Michael Ayres, was put in that predicament because his employers had put him there. And I think what's really relevant for all of us is to think not just about work-related driving, which is a potentially a legal obligation, but if we've got people who are 2 or 3 hours away from work, what are we actually asking them to do if we want to be a safer place? What's also interesting is that the Guinness World Book of Records used to have records of sleep deprivations, how long someone could stay awake for. And in the 1980s, they stopped doing that record because they could see just how harmful it was. Very good book on the subject by Matthew Walker, written in 2018, entitled Why We Sleep, made this one notation. One brain function that buckles under even the smallest dose of sleep deprivation is concentration. Every hour, someone in the US dies in a traffic accident due to a fatigue-related error. That's a staggering statistic and one that we need to be mindful of.
That's cool. Don't just listen to us though. We've engaged an expert, Dr. Alana Hare, who's a consultant physician at the Imperial College in London, who has assisted us in providing an overview of some of the experiments that they conducted or she's researched, which relate to chronic fatigue and the impact this may have.
Hello, my name is Dr. Ali Hare and I'm a sleep specialist. This short video is all about the R of rest from rope theory. Van Dongen and colleagues in 2003 published research designed to explore the consequences of chronic reduction in sleep with a dose-response chronic sleep restriction experiment in which awake, cognitive and sleep physiology functions were monitored and compared to those for total sleep deprivation. The chronic sleep restriction experiment involved randomizing 48 healthy adults aged between 21 and 38 to one of 3 sleep doses, either 4 hours, 6 hours, or 8 hours time in bed per night, which were maintained for 14 consecutive days. The total sleep deprivation experiment involved 3 nights without sleep, 0 hours in the bed. Each study also involved 3 baseline pre-deprivation days and 3 recovery days. These experiments were conducted under laboratory conditions with continuous monitoring of behavioral, physiological, and medical factors. The study demonstrated that chronic sleep restriction periods of 4 hours or 6 hours per night over 14 consecutive days resulted in significant cumulative and dose-dependent deficits in cognitive performance on all tasks, including psychomotor vigilar performance, working memory performance, and overall cognitive performance. Chronic sleep restriction to 6 hours or less per night for 14 nights produced cognitive performance deficits equivalent to up to 2 nights of total sleep deprivation. Subjective sleepiness ratings over this period did show an acute response to sleep restriction, but on subsequent nights there were only small further increases in reports of sleepiness. And these reports did not significantly differ between the 6-hour and 4-hour conditions. This study demonstrated then that even relatively moderate sleep restriction can seriously impair waking neurobehavioral functions, even in healthy, relatively young adults. As sleep debt grows, individuals became less alert and had increased difficulty in following simple tasks. Reductions in attention like this can make a sleep-deprived person more prone to mistakes, increasing the risk of workplace or motor vehicle accidents. Perhaps more importantly, however, subjective sleepiness ratings suggest that subjects were largely unaware of these increasing cognitive deficits. explaining why many individuals do not recognise how impaired they are after a period of sleep restriction. This serves to emphasise that whilst after an acute period of sleep restriction we may be aware that we're tired and perhaps not performing at our best, as sleep restriction continues beyond 1 or 2 nights, we become increasingly less aware of our significant limitations, which can have a major impact on safety at work and on the road. Organisational leaders and managers may therefore themselves need to be vigilant to signs of sleep deprivation in workers, should ensure working patterns support healthy sleep, and should support employees to speak up if they are concerned about tiredness, sleep loss, or fatigue. Caffeine, of course, is the most widely used stimulant to counteract the effects of sleepiness, but it also produces important detrimental effects on subsequent sleep, especially when sleep is initiated at a time when the biological clock is sending a strong waking signal, such as during the daytime. Caffeine primarily works by blocking adenosine receptors. In the doses commonly consumed from coffee, tea, or energy drinks, between 60 and 300 milligrams per drink, acute caffeine promotes vigilance, attention, and mood by blocking adenosine receptors, particularly in conditions of insufficient sleep and increased sleepiness. Individual differences in the effects of caffeine on sleep and wakefulness have a biological basis in genetic variants that code for these adenosine receptors. Adenosine promotes the sleep drive, or a person's need for sleep. The sleep drive helps the body maintain sleep-wake homeostasis, or the right amount of sleep and wakefulness over time. Simply put, the longer a person stays awake, the stronger their sleep drive becomes. When a person is deprived of sleep, the sleep drive prompts them to sleep more intensely and for a longer period of time the next time they sleep. Adenosine is probably involved in this adaptive homeostatic response to the prior duration of sleep and wakefulness, as its levels rise in the course of sleep deprivation and decrease during recovery sleep. Recent research conducted with mice suggests adenosine also affects circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are the multiple physical changes that occur over each 24-hour day, including the sleep-wake schedule. You are likely aware of melatonin, a circadian rhythm hormone that promotes sleep by reacting to light and darkness. Similarly, adenosine also appears to influence sleep timing in response to light and darkness, as well as in response to recent sleep history, as I've described before. However, whilst caffeine is effective at reducing sleepiness, the consumption of caffeine in response to insufficient sleep may impair the onset and maintenance of subsequent sleep. A systematic review and meta-analysis investigated the effects of caffeine on the characteristics of nighttime sleep, aiming to identify the time after which caffeine should not be consumed prior to bedtime. Caffeine consumption was found to reduce total sleep time by 45 minutes and sleep efficiency by 7%, with an increase in the time taken to fall asleep and the time spent awake during the night. The duration and proportion of light sleep increased with caffeine intake, whilst the duration and proportion of deep sleep decreased. The authors of this study therefore recommended that in order to avoid reductions in total sleep time, coffee should be consumed at least 9 hours prior to bedtime, and a standard serve of a pre-workout supplement of around 200 milligrams of caffeine should be consumed at least 13 hours prior to planned bedtime. In a work situation then, where workers may have suffered from the cumulative effects not only of reduced sleep, perhaps from working prolonged hours or shift working, but also the impact of family circumstances, poor sleep hygiene, sleep problems, or enhanced wakefulness from caffeinated drinks, safety can be impaired. The rope theory case study of the Everest ascent is one extreme example, but it doesn't need to be as extreme as this. Thinking about the importance of sleep and the impact of sleep in our day-to-day working environments can help us provide a better and safer environment for our teams, and should always, therefore, be a key area of management focus. Thank you.
And just moving on from that, in terms of organisations managing fatigue, we've touched on risk assessments. Managers should be looking at fatigue risks in terms of planning work, which we'll come on to as later part of the rope theory. Managers should be speaking to the work teams to understand if there's any challenges outside of work which they need to be taken into account, perhaps looking at shift patterns and looking at performance, and speaking to the workforce, engaging them to speak out if there is fatigue or they have concerns around that, will all help in terms of managing this risk within your organisations. Now we move on to observation. That's the O in the rope theory. Moving back to the ascent of Everest, there is an element when they start to get towards the Hillary step where climbers could fall 50,000 feet, 10,000 feet, sorry, one side and 8,000 feet the other side. Is a highly stressful, dangerous environment. Now, I'm not saying that we experience such dangers in our everyday work, but it does show that stress can impact on how we perform. Simple tasks that perhaps early in our career or early in the working day are easy to undertake when we're not stressed or anxious become a lot harder, a lot more difficult, and people's judgments and the way they attend to these tasks and plan and pursue these tasks changes. And as organisations, as employers, we should be mindful of how stress, anxiety, and mental health challenges may impact our employees when undertaking day-to-day tasks. We saw this clearly in the pandemic. Unfortunately, we represented a food manufacturing business where, due to short numbers of staff during the pandemic, a lady was promoted to a shift manager role on one of the production lines. Unfortunately, she perhaps hadn't had the necessary training or support during this promotion to help her with those skills and how to manage and oversee the production line and her junior colleagues. She was also struggling with pressures at home, like many of us in the pandemic, battling childcare. Her mother was living on her own, who also needed support, and her husband at the time was out of work due to the pandemic. So this lady had a lot of challenges. So normal processes that she'd been doing day in, day out as an operative, and now as a shift manager on the line, perhaps more challenging, and impairing her judgment in remembering things and the process in which tasks had to be completed. In view of her promotion, she was then looking after and managing a junior team. And as part of the production process, a guard was removed to attend to a fault and wasn't correctly reinstated. This caused a junior operative to lose some fingers in an incident. The issue here when an incident investigation was undertaken was it was a failure to undertake observations, a failure to check in with this newly promoted shift manager by more senior managers to check that she understood the process, had support in this development in her role, and also to check how she was doing generally in terms of a well-being and mental wellness point of view. And so that really did put her at risk, but other colleagues at risk, because there wasn't that oversight. There wasn't that planning in terms of progressing her role, understanding her tasks and how she would move in that newly promoted role, but also checking how she was doing, checking overall performance and checking if there was any difficulties. We've definitely seen a shift from the regulator, the health and safety executive, more into the health side in the last few years, with a particular focus on well-being programs and strategies and mental wellness support that organisations are providing their employees. Definitely employers now have a more active role in managing mental wellness and supporting employees in this. And that's really looking at the behaviour. And these aren't just simple observations. They need to be repeat observations. They need to be looked at different times of the day. One of the issues we've seen is that shift patterns, perhaps people in an evening behave very differently to those in the day when there's perhaps more managers on site. So it's really making sure that we do worthwhile observations, there's a structure to the observations, an opportunity for employees to speak out and be signposted to additional provisions or a framework or documents if required, but also ability to repeat and do routine observations so we can manage performance and oversee performance over a period of time to see where improvements need to be made. And this goes on to empowerment, which is part of our rope theory at the end. So observations are very important and help us plan and manage effectively, which we'll move on to next in our rope theory.
Before we do that, I just want to call out the fact that when we talk about observations, we're not talking about kind of a Taylor-esque style of standing over people with a stopwatch. What we're talking about is that process by which people feel comfortable to talk about, and where people who are in supervisor or management positions know their teams well enough to be able to help them de-escalate and cope with the vicissitudes of life. For a climber, high altitude sickness or cerebral edema can strike in that death zone which Sarah alluded to. And that's literally where the brain starts to swell from the pressure. It's known that if you were to be at ground level and take a jumbo jet straight to the top of Everest and you came out, you would die from the pressure that was there. But by this acclimatization, you get used to it, you can cope with it. And in our daily lives, what seems intolerable on its own, quite often is something that we've worked up to. It's the boiling frog analogy. If someone's got altitude sickness on Everest, there's only one answer for it, and that's that they've got to descend the mountain. Not all the way down, but they've just got to lessen the pressure. And with observation, what we're saying is, as good managers, to make us 1% safer, to be able to be in tune with our people, to help them cope with the issues they've got, maybe just help them de-escalate, come down the mountain a little bit, to enable them to be able to level and go back up. Let's talk about planning, because planning is very much in the context of the 1996 ascent of Everest. And in 1996, two world-renowned climbers were taking separate parties up the mountain. One of them was led by a man called Rob Hall. And Rob Hall, on the 9th of May 1996, had said to his team, what's really important is that you listen to me, you do as you're told. If you don't like something, that's fine, we can talk about it when we're down the hill, how we described it, but there's no descent when we're going up. And what he said was, it's vitally important that we observe a turnaround time. The absolute turnaround time is 2 o'clock, because if you've not made the summit by 2 o'clock, we won't be down in time for us to be safe on our return. What happened in 1996 is that due to a number of issues, one of which was that he got a returning climber who'd failed at the turnaround time the year before, Hall ignored his own plan. And it was actually 4 o'clock by the time that Hall and this other climber turned around and started going down. Then external events, weather, storms, plummeting temperatures, resulted in a catastrophe in which 6 people died. Now, planning for health and safety professionals and modern business leaders is not a new concept. We all know that fail to plan is preparing to fail, all of those kind of issues. But when it comes to a safety context, it's vitally important that we've got to think about what if scenarios. What if someone doesn't do as we expect? And Todd Conklin, well-known behavioural psychologist in this field, says what's on the screen. It says in a couple of places, but this is pre-accident investigations. Prevention efforts can't prevent causes that are not expected, just as planning can't plan for unexpected events. We're so invested in preventing accidents, we don't effectively build resilience, is what he's saying. And one of the things that we talk to our clients about an awful lot is, how do we expect work to be done? And that's on the next slide, the diagram that comes from Conklin's work and what actually gets done. And we've called it quite provocatively, work envisaged is work as done, because we all know that's not true. There's a massive difference between what someone can sit and write in a safety management system and what someone on an engineering site or a construction site or in a factory or in an office will actually do. Because what seems sensible when we've got paper in front of us may be very different to emerging scenario. When it comes to planning in the rope theory, the Verrico Valentine model, it's about considering the skills which workers will require to work dynamically in a changing environment. It's about considering the metrics and the data that the organisation needs to gather to become a learning organisation, rather than one that looks backwards at lagging indicators. We see lots of leaders tracking the completion and observation of risk assessments as a leading metric, and that would show that planning is being disseminated throughout the workforce. We think it's really important as people who work in this area to go beyond that when we look at training. So many of our clients, after an incident, will show us a training matrix that will say, we've planned for people to be trained, here is the evidence that they've been trained. What's often missing is any kind of indicator or litmus test that training is cogent, well delivered, people enjoyed it, and that there was some learning around it. And we're seeing larger organisations now move towards employing people as professional trainers, not with the skills background of the discipline that they're training, but with the qualifications to impart knowledge in a way that makes people feel that they've benefited from the training. We've all sat through things like manual handling training, maybe in jobs before the one that we're now doing, where the trainer's doing it because they've got to do it. We're sat in the room because we've been told we've got to sit in the room, and no one really wants to be there. Whereas with a little bit more forethought, an hour session on manual handling could actually be delivered in a way that was both interesting, helpful, and would change behaviour. And when we look at modern behavioural psychology, and we look at things such as the COM-B model, people have got to be competent, and that's what training should do. But more than anything, they've got to be motivated. And people are not going to be motivated to change their behaviour unless there's some learning around why to change. And just taking manual handling to the next level, see some of our clients who actually employ osteopaths or physios to come and deliver manual handling training, because they think that if people understand why they need to do things better, they will do so. So the P for us in planning isn't just about risk assessment, it's about planning how the safety management system is effective, how the leading indicators will have the most benefit, and how effective some of those things are. Because if we look at the plan, do, check, act cycle, that's the Deming or the Health and Safety Executive in the UK or whatever else we want to look at, planning is part of a continuous process, and that feedback loop is vital for that to work. Ambiguity prompts panic. We want people to be resilient, and we want to plan for the fact they're going to encounter situations which aren't immediately obvious to us when we sit behind wooden desks in well-lit environments. Our final letter, the E of rope theory, is empowerment. And when we look at empowerment, one of the lessons from the 1996 ascent of Everest was that people didn't feel able to speak up to Rob Hall because he'd said, "My word is the law and you will listen regardless." And in Krakauer's book, he talks about the fact that a fellow climber who was a pilot, when they're up above the clouds, looks down on them and says to Krakauer, "There are some wispy clouds down there. In my experience, those are the crowns of robust thunderheads," i.e. a storm was on its way. And he knew that from his own experience, which was different to Hall's and different to Krakauer's, but he didn't feel able to mention it to Rob Hall. And as a result of that, when the weather came in, Hall was underprepared, and there was information that could have been shared that would have helped him. As a result of that, the disaster unfolded. Where does that leave us in a modern situation? Well, as the next slide shows, since the seminal work of Amy Edmondson, psychological safety has become something that we all get used to talking about. ISO 45003 talks about how that might be monitored. But we wanted to share with you some views from Tom Gerriday, who is the compiler of the Psych Safety newsletter.
Hi, I'm Tom Gerriday, the founder of PsychSafety.com, where we work to make the world of work a psychologically safer, more inclusive, equitable, and higher performing place. I've read Paul and Sarah's rope theory of rest, observation, planning, and empowerment, and I'm really pleased that empowerment forms part of their rationale for improving organizational safety performance. I believe that high performance means everyone on the team enjoys and is fulfilled by what they do. A team is only as safe as the least safe team member. And safety, psychological safety, is a prerequisite for empowerment. Risks are mitigated and hazards are spotted best when the safety climate of an organization is open and transparent, which is essentially the foundation of psychological safety. Psychological safety being the belief that you will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. First coined in the 1960s by Edgar Schein and Warren Bennis, psychological safety really came to prominence in the late 1990s when Amy Edmondson was studying high-performing and low-performing clinical teams. And what she found was that high-performing clinical teams were making more mistakes than the low-performing teams, and that didn't make sense. When she dived into the data a bit further and when she did a bit more research, what she found was that the high-performing teams were admitting and talking about their mistakes, and the low-performing teams were hiding theirs. And of course, that starts to make sense, doesn't it? It's only by talking about and admitting our mistakes that we can learn and improve continuously from them. The low-performing teams who hide their mistakes, conversely, are stuck in the low-performing zone until something else changes on the team. Previously, psychological safety was an implicit component of ideas like crew resource management in aviation, just culture in healthcare, the Toyota production system. But now, psychological safety is part of our wider work-life lexicon, part of our shared language, which is really, really powerful. Because it's only by having language for something that we can understand it, and more importantly, take concrete actions to build, foster, and maintain it. And if I was going to suggest just one thing to immediately change the psychological safety climate in your teams and your organization, it's simply reframing. Reframe work as an experiment, an opportunity to make something better and do it better next time. The outcome of work shouldn't just be the job itself, but learning how to do it even better next time. An experiment. After all, the only experiment that fails is the one we didn't learn from. Thanks for learning. Thanks for watching, and stay safe.
Thank you, Tom. And here are some excerpts from Edmondson's work, which just are things for us to think about. The key here is to remember that workers aren't the problem, workers are the problem solvers. It's about creating authentic experiences from which workers can learn, engage, and share with colleagues, and on us as leaders to make sure that people have the ability to be empowered to share where things are wrong, to anticipate risks before failure occurs, and not to be complicit in allowing organisational drift to continue. Employee engagement is crucial in this space. And one of the things that we see is the image of the watermelon. And Carson Bush talks about this in his book. It's an image that we communicate with a lot of leaders around. The idea that if the culture of the organisation is to have green indicators, total recordable incidents, audits that suggest that we don't have problems, but at the water cooler, employees are talking doomsday language, where it's red on the inside, we've not managed to succeed in RE. If we are a checklist organisation and we do audits rather than reviews, we look for a root cause and we blame the individual, then we have a non-empowered company or organisation. What we're really encouraging is that we look at the behaviours of ourselves and our teams and our supervisors to make sure that there's that upward engagement for people to be able to communicate. And we don't mean saying, my door's always open, you can come and talk to me. We mean something much more powerful than that. If we look at Jack Dorsey at Twitter, he would work out on the floor at standing desk, so an employee, so he just heard the chit chat, and he knew what the temperature of the room was, and that he could therefore engage in conversation. So as we conclude this presentation and we move into our question session, I want to just focus on two things. First is that rope is a convenient acronym. Of course, for Sir Edmund Hillary, holding onto the rope was vital for him to ascend. And for all successful climbers of high altitudes, whether that be mountains, careers, tasks, we need something to hold on to. And we postulate that rest, observation, planning, and empowerment are keys that we can anchor on, that we can cramp on in order to be able to perform things successfully. And finally, with the image of Everest, we say this: whether you cope or not with the pressure that's put upon you can depend upon how prepared you are for that pressure. And there are all kinds of elements that come into that. Fatigue's massive, as we've said. Whether or not that we can see that people around us are struggling and patch into that and help them Well, we've really planned to think about the non-predictables. Are people resilient enough to be able to cope on their own? And have we given them the option to be able to communicate and empower them? Whatever the mountain that you face, we believe that bearing in mind that acronym, REST, observation, planning and empowerment, we feel that you'll be best equipped to deal with whichever arduous adventure you're involved in your workplace. My name is Paul Verrico, this is Sarah Valentine, and that is Rope Theory.
Thank you both. I've been gripped throughout all of that personally, and I found that absolutely fantastic to hear. We've got little people clapping and images and things coming through, and we've had feedback throughout the session of how useful that was. So I'm sure that the listeners are keen to ask some questions. I've got a couple that we had in advance, if that's okay, just from my perspective, because I think the people that listen to that, if they take only just snippets of bits and pieces away and then implement them, when we're talking about 1% safety or improvement and marginal gains, there could be so much to be gained from that, couldn't there? So it very much aligned with my own views on things. So I think for both of you, I'd be really interested to know. So 2023, here we are now. We've had a backdrop of pandemic and COVID and civil unrest in the world and a whole host of other challenges, I suppose, that have unsettled things at the moment. What do you think is still preventing even better safety performance currently worldwide? What is the main blocker or challenge that we have today?
I think we come back to behaviour. And Emma, you'll know this as a lawyer, but there's always that kind of disconnect between leaders thinking, well, we've written the system and the system's good because we pay consultants, so we've got clever people who've written the system. And then when people deviate from it, blaming the worker rather than thinking, why have they done what they've done? And one of the concepts in neurolinguistic programming, as well as HOP theory, is that people do what makes sense to them at the moment that they did the thing. And if the thing ends up going wrong, it still made sense when they did it. And I think there's a disconnect between, in a boardroom, maybe if you've not got the immediate experience performing the task, of understanding that our job as safety people and as leaders is try and make the process as simple as it humanly can be. And I think that disconnect means that sometimes there's almost a blame culture when things go wrong. And it's a human nature, isn't it? We want someone to blame. And that can just disengage the workforce entirely. And if we find the root cause is human error, then that doesn't in any way encourage us to improve the process. So I'm a very strong believer that in 2023, for some companies that may be less enlightened, that's a real problem that would really move them up the ladder.
No, thank you. And obviously that very much fits in with this whole psychological safety piece, right? Making people feel comfortable enough to call out, challenge behavior, or safe enough to raise, things they see that aren't safe in the workplace. That there's massive amounts of work to be done there as well. I totally agree. I think, what do you think then in terms of your rope theory's got sort of the 4 elements, and it's all about bringing them together to get better safety performance and gains. What would you say your key takeaway would be if you're going to say about one thing, just one thing that people could do differently then?
I think it's rest. It's the fatigue point. We talked about this earlier, and that's probably one of the key points, the key takeaway. My experience, 20 years doing health and safety work, it's always been one of the factors when there's incident investigations, that fatigue is possibly one of the issues. And not just tiredness, but, repetitious jobs and tasks where people start to mind wanders and things, so, kind of fatigue of the task itself. And I think one of the important things when we were putting in this theory together, and we had the expert assistance from Alana, is that people just don't recognise that it's an impairment. People, don't understand that their ability to make judgments and decisions may be impaired because they're, slightly sleep deprived, a little bit fatigued. And I think that feeds into that behaviour piece, and also just learning from, taking the opportunity to learn in incident investigations, near misses, etc. That, this is one of the factors to learn from, and build in a bit more safeguarding and resilience around that.
I think on that, we're always surprised at how little people understand about the science of sleep. So something like Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, international bestseller in 2018, but maybe hasn't permeated the profession as much as it should. And when you actually look at the science of how adenosine builds up, you quickly realise that actually it's just science. And however much you think that you're going to be okay, it's just science. And I think that just base understanding would really help professionals in terms of their risk assessment process.
No, great. Thank you. Thank you. And I think I'm going to take it to the floor too in a minute, but I just want to kind of put this. So we've said what's the main kind of blocker or prevention of better performance worldwide would be behavioural culture. We've got the main key takeaway from your session, probably fatigue and refocusing that within the workplace context and what can be done. I think, what do you think is your kind of parting message from you both about how businesses worldwide could look at making themselves 1% safer? If they were only going to improve by 1%. What's your parting thoughts or point to sort of champion?
I'm not going to try and be original on this. Amy Edmondson in Fearless Organisation talks about a VUCA environment, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, effectively saying the world's changed, are we changing with it? And teams with high psychological safety can diagnose problems as they start to emerge, and they can respond to that uncertainty, whether that's personally, the work environment, or the challenges that come in from the economy, or whatever that might be. And I think workers need to be listened to by leaders, and that leaders need to convince workers that they are not pro-failure, but they're pro-learning. And I think that if that communication channel eventuates and is embedded deeper, then things will be better. And actually, Edmondson, in her book, actually provides a toolkit for building psychological safety. And I commend that very dearly to all those watching and listening to this.
Sarah, anything from you?
And I think just agreeing with Paul on that point, and Todd Conklin put it that workers aren't the problem, they are the solution. And I think they are the solution to empowerment, planning, observation. You need workers to help drive forward all improvements in all those areas that form part of ROPE. And real engagement is really the way forward, I think, for an organisation to to be 1%, at least 1% safer, and really drive up safety performance and put health and safety on the map in a positive light. Often it can be seen as a bit of a negative, and people think we're going to be coming around with clipboards and pens in our pockets and things, but it's not about that. It's more about improving safety cultures, improving messaging around safety, and as Paul touched on, the appetite to learn, to improve. What's good, when's the job done, what does that entail, and that really.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to just now put it out to the floor, really. If anybody would like to ask a question, we have got the chat function running, so please do put them in the chat and I can monitor that. Or if you feel more comfortable, raise your hand and you'd like to actually speak with our speakers, then feel free to do that too. Let's see, give a few minutes just to see what comes in. We have got some raise your hands. So we've got anything in the chat just yet as well? No, we've got somebody very keen in the chat. So I will ask you to, I'll sort of permit you to allow you to talk. I've got a button I have to click. So I will do that. And then if you'd like to introduce yourself and put your question to our speakers, then feel free. So I'll do that now. Let's go there first. Hello, can you hear me? The gentleman or lady that's put themselves on, raise your hand. I think you might have to unmute yourself. I'm trying to also do it from my side. See if we. Hello. We're having trouble with that, I think. So maybe it's going to be better to do this via the chat if that raise your hand doesn't work. Let me see if I can go to another person that might have their hand up and see if we can. We've only got one still at the moment. So let me just go to the chat. What have we got in the chat? Would it be possible, somebody in the chat, I don't think it's the same person, so if that person that had raised the hand very keenly trying to put their question in the chat, I'll come back to you, but somebody's asked, would it be possible to have a list of those key books that were mentioned? So we've got somebody that's very keen there on learning and following up and things, so if they would be able to just be a bit of a bio or the books, would that be possible?
Yeah, so very happy to do that. So Emma, the main theory has been published by IOSH this year, so there's 2 articles in IOSH and there's a whole reading list that goes with that. I think there's about 25 different sources, including the various papers. I'm very happy to share that with you for onward distribution to those who have attended this webinar.
Brilliant. No, thank you. And one of the other participants has very kindly linked into the chat there, the IOSH, one of the publications, I think, mentioned in some of the articles as well. So there is a link that's been put through in the chat box there. And somebody's actually sharing some of the names of the books and stuff. So everybody's chatting about it now.
Excellent.
So you definitely got some engagement here on this topic, which is good news. Let's see, anybody else with any questions? I'm just going to check again the raise your hand function. See if we can get to that person.
I think just on that literature point, Emma, I think the point for us is that we're not claiming that we're original thinkers in this space. I think what we're saying is that we see the context of a lot of this at the sharp end when it's gone wrong. And we're really hopeful that by kind of pulling it together, that we can actually just point people towards the sources for them to make their own judgments as to what will help them. So I'm really glad that people have asked to look at some of these works. I would massively recommend Amy Edmondson, and I'd massively recommend some of the work that Todd Conklin in particular has done in the last 2 or 3 years, which is really helpful in this space.
No, brilliant. And we have got some later this week, some community sessions, because I think as well, sharing know-how, sharing knowledge, getting to learn from other people is key to all of this. You know, that's where you can really pick up some ways and tips of how are others performing, what are they doing, how can we improve ourselves against other people. So we have got community sessions as well running later this week. So do check those out if you're not already signed up to them. We've got another question that's come in saying, how important is the sharing of good practice for developing improving psychological safety? So that's kind of what we're feeding quite nicely with what we've just been talking about.
It's a great segue, and I think good practice is important. I think people are already kind of encouraged to do that. I think what Edmondson says, and of course what Tom mentioned in his video, is that really high performing companies actually likely talk about their failures more than their wins, because they want to learn. And for me, it's about being a learning organisation. One of the other things is, of course, if you're a large multinational organisation, how well you're embedded with what people in different countries are doing that might be best practice. And we do sometimes see that there's a bit of a siloed approach where a factory in Grantham, Lincolnshire might be very different to a factory in Boston, US, but they're both working on exactly the same problem and they've both got separate solutions and they both work for the same organisation. So that kind of master sharing and pulling a safety strategy together at global or international, even countrywide level is massively important, both to build psychological safety, but also safety resilience in the organisation.
Thank you. I'm going to go try just with our final person, who is our keen person with the hand up, to see if I can get them to see if we can get them to speak to us. And if we can't, I do very much apologise. With your hand up there, if you're still with us, are you able to unmute? Sadly, I don't think we can, but I'll try and follow up with that person after today and make sure if we had a question here that we kind of put you in touch and that question gets dealt with, if that's okay. Well, I'd like to just kind of come to close. We're good for time, but very much to say thank you to our two speakers today. I've certainly taken away from that so much, and I know that the audience are as well. Again, we've got claps and thank yous kind of coming through at the moment. I'd also like to say today that we would like to invite everybody that if you don't know much about 1% Safer already, or the foundation, what the cause is, what the movement's about, but would like to find out more along this line, please have a look at our website, 1percentsafer.com. And we've got various things at the beginning, like I mentioned, the book. If you haven't read it, I've got a copy myself. I love it, promote it. So go and have a look, buy the book, see whether people in your organization might want to share that knowledge and take that knowledge away. Join the movement, join the community, share know-how, because that's very much what we're about. And again, as I said, we're grant giving. We promote and get funds from the book sales, which is to promote our causes that I outlined at the beginning. So make an application, promote the cause across the as to what we can do. And if you feel you've got something you wish to make an application for, obviously consider making an application too. And with that, I would also like to thank, please, today, what we've been able to do this today through our media sponsors and our sponsors, Quintech, Eco Online, Cority and Saferpedia. And thank you very much for joining. I wish you all well. Have a great rest of the day. And thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.